Hey everybody, so welcome back, and the sun's a little bit in my face today, but that'll just create some dramatic lighting, perhaps. I'm Matthew Van Deventer, and I'm making a puzzle game called Taiji. It's a open world adventure type game that takes pretty big inspiration from The Witness. If that type of thing sounds interesting to you, there's a link in the description below the video. So, the past 2 weeks have been spent on the in-game puzzles, mostly on tech stuff, a little bit on design stuff, but I will say that I've at least gotten 90% of the tech issues resolved. The puzzle design stuff is still, there's a lot to do there, but the tech stuff, which was really kind of stymieing, has finally been resolved. So I ran into a little bit of a fun, at least amusing to me, technical snafu with these in-game puzzles, and it's not really a spoiler, but it'll be amusing to some programmers, I suppose. So in the process of trying to solve this, I finally came up with kind of what I thought was an elegant solution that's like a recursive function, but as oftentimes seems to happen with recursive functions, especially in higher level languages like C#, past a trivial level of recursions, it was just way too slow. So I ended up having to do kind of the silly thing where there's no like straightforward iterative solution for that. So instead what I have to do is I just kind of have to take the recursive solution and just write, you know, kind of like you would unroll a loop where you would just write everything 100 times. This is kind of like that, where I would just write the recursion depths kind of in straight line and put it in a switch statement that's like, how many recursions are there? How many recursions do there need to be, right? So it would just kind of pre-calculate that and then just pick the the version of that. So, you know, maybe that's not that amusing, but I found it amusing because it was sort of like taking this elegant piece of code that did the general case, but it kind of did it slowly, and then kind of having to unroll that into a really ugly piece of code that can only do like, you know, 6 recursion depths, but that covers like most of the stuff that I'm doing. Anyway, so with that, I'd like to get into our topic of the week. And the topic of the week this week is puzzle design. I think we've talked about puzzle design on here before, but I want to talk about specifically some of the things that I've learned in puzzle design since my last lecture that I gave, I don't even know, many years ago at this point. But if you haven't seen that lecture, I'll put a little link up here. It's called the Do's and Don'ts of Honest Puzzle Game Design. You may have actually even seen it and didn't know it was me. But if you haven't seen it, it's worth watching, especially if you're interested in puzzle game design. But I've wanted to, for many years, do a follow-up lecture on some of the other things that I've learned, right? The biggest problem has been that with Taiji, I don't really want to spoil things, and the easiest way for me to talk about what I've learned in design is like with the exact example of, here's this in action, here's how I would use this, right? Here's what I was thinking about designing these puzzles, but I don't want to spoil much, so I haven't really been able to do it. But today, I've just kind of decided to bite the bullet a little bit, and I'm going to spoil a very early kind of set of puzzles just to talk about what I was thinking about with the design there. So this may or may not be something you want to watch if you don't want any of the game spoiled. But I will say, if you've seen my little explanation in the What is Taiji devlog video, this will be the same set of puzzles. I'm just going to kind of talk about them in more detail rather than just saying kind of what at first blush your impression of those puzzles would be. So to do that, let's go inside. All right, so we're going to look at basically the same set of puzzles that I looked at in the What is Taiji video, which I'll put another link up here if YouTube will let me. So you shouldn't be spoiled on anything as far as puzzle solutions, although me talking about it more obviously would count as spoilers. But in any case, I kind of want to use these as an example to talk about kind of what I'm thinking about when I design sequences of puzzles. So with most games, you kind of have an ideal player in mind, right? But for most games, they tend to worry more about their designing for what you might call the asshole player. So you're kind of trying to design the game to where it won't break
in the worst case, right? In the case of a player who's kind of trying to break the game. So I don't really worry about that. Instead, I do just design specifically around an ideal player. So my ideal player for Taiji essentially is somebody who wants to think hard and they want to pay close attention. So those are actually such important things about, I feel like, the experience that I want a player to have and what their mindset should be going into the game if they want to have a good experience, that they're literally just listed on the website for the game and the Steam description for the game. So it's kind of just part of the pitch of the game to you, right? Is that those two things are important. So I just take it kind of as a given that the player is going to be doing those things. This means if the player's not paying attention or the player's not thinking very hard, then they're probably going to have a bad experience with the game. But we don't worry about that too much. Anyway, so when the player comes up here, they might go this way or they might go to these first. If they go up here, they're unlikely to make much progress because they don't really know much about what these little symbols mean. If they were to try to solve that, then okay, I guess that's solved, but there's not much to do there. So they're likely to realize, hopefully, that this might be related, and then go over here and find an easy panel. So oftentimes, and this is kind of the same thing that happens in the Witness, you start an area with a very simple puzzle that's very easy to solve. It's pretty easy to brute force, even if you wanted to brute force it. It's just kind of meant to introduce you to the idea. So in this case, you've just got a simple 4x4 grid, and there's one tile that has these little black dots on it, which is kind of what we're introducing here. So I expect most players would come up here, and this is sort of what I model in my mind when I'm thinking about players. I think about most players and, most of, I guess, my ideal player set, right? So most players would come up here, and they're probably going to click the tile with the dot on it and try that. And so that works. Now, there are some players that are going to be more kind of investigative, and then they might try some other things. But most players are probably just going to move on at this point, right? And so they're going to say, okay, well, last time we kind of clicked to the ones with the dots, so let's try that again. So that worked. And again, most players, when they make progress on a puzzle, they don't try alternate things. They just move on. So then this is kind of meant for most of those players who are just moving on to cause them to hit a roadblock, right? Because on this panel, let me reset it. So on this panel, these tiles are like locked on already. So if we're working under the assumption that what we do is turn those on, then, well, I guess that's the solution to the panel. But that doesn't do us any good here because we can't get across this gap, right? With that, we can only like walk to this little bit and that's it. So there's kind of two players at this point. One player might muck around over here and the other player might come back and see if there's something that they missed back here. So my hope is that they'll come back and they'll try messing around with this puzzle, and eventually they'll stumble upon that they can do this corner and that's fine. The others are not fine. You can't do anything else, really. You can invert it, but we'll get back to that later. That's something players might figure out, but it seems unlikely. Any case. So my hope is that they figure that out, and then they come back over here, and then they say, okay, well, what are the corner tiles? So here's a corner tile, right? So we can turn those on. And that still does not get you through here. So I still expect you to figure out a little bit more. So you're thinking, okay, well, those corners didn't matter, so maybe like the ones that are not touching it, right, are the ones that we can toggle. So at that point, you figured a way across the bridge. You don't have to do these far corner ones, but those are equivalent solutions in my mind because I'm expecting you to figure out that thing, that concept of like, okay, it's the ones that aren't directly adjacent to it. Those don't matter, right? It's sort of what I'm forcing you to do there. So then you might come up here, and this sequence here is kind of designed to be taken two ways, just depending on the player. It's here to kind of give a moment for one type of player, and then for other players it's just meant to... It's not really padding, I don't want to say that, but it's meant to kind of let you feel a sense of accomplishment in the sense that, okay, I know what I'm doing a little bit, right? And there's a little bit of trickiness to the last panel for most players, but otherwise it should be fine. Anyway, so some players are going to come up here and they're just going to say, okay, well, let me turn all these on, and that seems fine. And let me turn all these on, and that seems fine. And then we get to this one. Let me turn all these on. Oh, okay, these ones I can't turn on, so what does that mean? So then they'll end up with a little bit of a roadblock here until they realize, you know, either they'll run back and try some other things earlier on, or maybe they'll just think, okay, well, what if it's like the inverse, right? So now these ones need to be on in order to isolate that or something. And so that works. Now the other player that I'm having here, or that I'm imagining here, is not really going to have a problem with this one. But what they're going to be thinking about the whole time is that, oh, I guess these need to be isolated. And so they might think that this one needs to be off. And so they'll do this type of solution on the first one. This might seem like a counterintuitive solution, but there are players that this is what they try first, right? So then when they get here, I'm actually forcing them by the fact that these corners are locked off, that you can't checkerboard the panel in the same way as you would do there. So instead you're forced to group these, so you have to learn that you can group them. Again, it just depends on the concepts that players are having, right? Some players think what it means is that I turn them on. Some players think what it means is that it needs to be isolated. So at this point, this is to force you to realize, oh, okay, I can actually group them if they're both adjacent, right? And so then for that player, this one's not going to be that difficult because they already know that those can be off. So they're just going to kind of solve their way through that. And then this one's just a little bit of a test, combining all those things that you know and combining that with this bridge so that you kind of know, okay, I need to get from here to here. I don't think I actually talked about this on the last one, so I don't want to spoil that one too much. But I think that even though that's a fairly lightweight and very early set of puzzles in this area, the area goes on for, I don't know, something like 20 or 30 more puzzles. And there's other more complex puzzles in the game that use these mechanics. That's maybe enough to just kind of give you a sense of, here's what I think about when I'm designing a set of puzzles. I'm thinking about what different scenarios might be for different players. You know, some players might be thinking this, some players might be thinking that. And so I'm not always just designing an ideal experience, I'm sort of designing opportunities for players to have certain experiences or notice certain things, right? So in the sense of, you know, forcing you to not checkerboard here, like I'm forcing some players to notice, oh, they can actually be grouped at this point. Versus other players that may just be turning them on and just thinking, well, that's how it works. They may notice based on these that they can be grouped, right? They may think, oh, okay, they can be grouped. But they may not even be noticing. They may just sleepwalk. And so for them, at this point, this would be the thing to break the sleepwalk, is, oh, they can actually be off. So I guess it's something else I don't quite understand, but maybe we'll move on and figure that out, right? And then this should help them figure that out, this next puzzle. Anyway. Again, not a super well-organized discussion of how I think about designing puzzles now, but doing that would require more time, and also it would require me to, I think, spoil significantly more of the game than I really want to do before release. So that will have to wait till after the game is out. But in the meantime, hopefully that's interesting in kind of... Anyway, once again, the game's called Taiji. There's a link in the description. If you haven't wishlisted it on Steam, you should do that. And there's also another link in the description down there to the website for the game where you can find links out to the various social medias for the game. So I will see you all around, and we'll just leave you in this pleasant area. Let's go look at something a little different. We'll leave you over here.